Chaos erupted inside the Texas death chamber. Screams filled the witness room. Guards wrestled a man to the ground as another slammed his fists against the glass, separating him from his dying father. It was supposed to be a quiet execution, but when Billie Wayne Coble took his final breath, violence and grief exploded on both sides of the glass. As lethal chemicals coursed through his veins, Coble's son and grandson lost control, pounding the walls, shouting, "No, don't do this." Officers stormed in, dragging them out in handcuffs, while sobs echoed down the corridor. This was no ordinary execution. It was the final act of a man whose life had been defined by rage, ending the same way it began, in chaos. But to understand what led to this shocking scene inside the Huntsville death chamber, we have to go back to 1989, to a quiet rural community outside Waco, Texas. The day Billie Wayne Coble wiped out nearly an entire family in cold blood.
They tell you I killed 3 people? Huh? You're quiet. I would have never believed I'd do that either. See, y'all just shocked his argument.
In the summer of 1989, Billie Wayne Coble was a Vietnam veteran and troubled husband whose third marriage was crumbling. He had recently unleashed a bizarre outburst, hiding in his estranged wife's car trunk and kidnapping her at knife point after she filed for divorce. This incident landed him in jail, but Coble soon freed himself on bond, simmering with rage at his wife, Karen Vicha, for trying to leave him. On August 29, 1989, that rage exploded into a family massacre. Coble armed himself and went to the Vicha family's homes in the tiny town of Axtell, just northeast of Waco. First, at Karen's house, he handcuffed and tied up Karen's 3 young daughters along with her 11-year-old nephew, J.R. Vicha, terrorizing the 4 children at gunpoint. He locked them in a closet and warned them not to move. Then Coble set out to eliminate Karen's closest loved ones. In cold blood, he ambushed and fatally shot Karen's parents, Robert, 64, and Zelda Vicha, 60, in their home, and then gunned down her brother Bobby Vicha, 39, at his house nearby. Bobby was a Waco police sergeant, and Coble attacked him with the same ruthlessness, murdering him in his own driveway before he could react. When Karen Vicha drove home from work that evening, she was met with a scene of nightmares. Coble confronted her, boasting about the slaughter he had just carried out. "Karen, I've killed your mama and your daddy and your brother," he told his horrified wife. "They are all dead, and nobody is going to come help you now." Coble then forced Karen into his car at gunpoint, allowing her only a moment to kiss her bound children goodbye before dragging her away. As he sped off, he beat her viciously with his pistol, splitting her skin, and threatened to rape and murder her in a deserted field. By now, police were in pursuit, racing to save Karen's life. Coble attempted a desperate escape. During the high-speed chase, he even stabbed Karen in the face as he drove, and then deliberately crashed the car in an apparent bid for a murder-suicide, later saying he didn't want to die in prison. The wreck left Coble injured and dazed. Officers swarmed in, arresting him at the crash site and finally ending his rampage that same night. The Vicha family's nightmare had unfolded in only a few hours, leaving 3 dead and countless lives shattered. The Vicha family Coble destroyed was by all accounts loving and tight-knit. Robert Vicha, 64, was a retired plumber. His wife Zelda, 60, worked in a doctor's office, and they doted on their children and grandchildren. Their son Bobby Vicha, 39, was a respected police sergeant in Waco, a dedicated officer and father. Bobby's own young son, J.R., and 3 daughters were among the children Coble tied up at gunpoint that day. Mercifully, those 4 kids were spared physical harm, but they witnessed unspeakable terror. J.R. Vicha was just 11 years old when he lay bound, listening to his grandfather, grandmother, and father being gunned down by Coble. The emotional scars ran deep. 3 generations of the Vicha family were devastated in one afternoon. Years later, JR would grow up to become a prosecutor, inspired by his father's memory and the drive to seek justice. Every time I run into somebody that knew my dad or grandparents, it's a good feeling, JR reflected, still cherishing their legacy even decades after their loss. For the surviving Vichas, August 29, 1989 became an indelible date, the day a husband's vengeance destroyed their world. In June 1990, Billie Wayne Coble stood trial in McLennan County for capital murder. The courtroom testimony revealed the disturbing portrait of the man behind the massacre. Prosecutors presented evidence that Coble's violence was not an isolated burst of rage. He had a long history of brutality. Former wives recounted years of abuse, and even young girls testified to having been molested by Coble in the past. Jurors heard that he once tried to strangle a former spouse with a lamp cord and had terrorized women who dared leave him. One prosecutor would later describe Coble as having a heart full of scorpions inside, brimming with venomous cruelty. Coble's defense, in turn, highlighted his troubled background. He had essentially been raised in an orphanage after his mother was institutionalized. At 17, he enlisted in the Marines and went to Vietnam, serving as a machine gunner in combat. Family members said he returned from war different, haunted by undiagnosed PTSD and bipolar disorder that warped his mind. The jury weighed these facts, but Coble's lack of remorse loomed large. Colleagues recalled him smirking and cracking jokes at trial, as if indifferent. In August 1990, the jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to death for the triple murder. That seemed like the end of the legal saga, but twists in the case lay ahead. Coble's attorneys fought his sentence for years, and in 2007 they scored a rare victory. The Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals threw out his death sentence on a procedural issue. The appellate judges ruled that the jury hadn't been properly instructed to consider mitigating evidence, like Coble's traumatic upbringing, that might have persuaded them to choose life in prison. This decision didn't free Coble. His conviction stood, but it won him a new sentencing trial in 2008. During that resentencing, prosecutors doubled down on portraying Coble as irredeemably dangerous. They called expert witnesses who testified that even behind bars, Coble would be a menace, likely to commit violent acts in prison if given a life term. On the stand, a psychiatrist claimed Coble had an incurable personality primed for violence, and a criminal investigator painted a dire picture of prison brutality if Coble lived. The defense countered that Coble had been a model inmate for nearly 20 years at that point, with no serious infractions, stark evidence against the state's predictions. In fact, under cross-examination, the prosecution's expert admitted his methodology was unscientific, unable to cite any source or study for his future danger theory. Another state witness had embellished facts about prison violence. An appeals court later determined parts of his testimony were outright fabricated. These revelations of junk science cast a shadow on the proceedings. Nevertheless, the jury in 2008 was swayed by the heinous nature of Coble's crimes. They again delivered a sentence of death. He had no remorse at all, Prosecutor Crawford Long said of Coble, reaffirming that his heart full of scorpions characterization was sadly fitting. With that, Coble returned to death row to await execution. Over the next decade, his lawyers launched one appeal after another, arguing issues from prosecutorial misconduct to ineffective counsel. In one last maneuver, they pointed to a 2018 Supreme Court ruling, McCoy v. Louisiana, and claimed Coble's trial lawyers violated his rights by conceding his guilt against his wishes. But this too failed. By 2019, every legal avenue had been exhausted. It's disappointing, attorney A. Richard Ellis said. lamenting that he was executed on the basis of junk science and perjury. The courts, however, stood by the verdicts. Billie Coble would face the ultimate penalty. Coble's time on Texas death row stretched nearly 30 years, turning the once middle-aged man into a frail 70-year-old by the end. He became one of about 30 inmates who had lingered on Texas death row for over a quarter century. In fact, by 2019, Coble was the oldest prisoner in Texas slated for execution since the 1970s. Behind bars, Coble's behavior was cooperative and quiet. He accrued an almost blemish-free disciplinary record over decades. Gone was the brash killer who once terrorized a family. In his final years, Coble was described as a graying, ailing man in poor health. His attorneys argued that executing a 70-year-old who had spent half his life awaiting death served no purpose. He is now 70 years old in poor health and has an almost blemish-free prison record for the past 30 years, his lawyer wrote in a clemency plea. His execution would serve no valid purpose. But the state's answer was firm. Justice delayed would not be justice denied. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles rejected clemency, and courts refused to step in. On the afternoon of February 28, 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court turned down Coble's final appeal, removing the last obstacle to his execution just hours before it was scheduled. One notable absence in Coble's final days: there was no special last meal. In Texas, the tradition of granting condemned inmates a customized last meal was abolished in 2011. They now receive the same meal as any other inmate on execution day. So, unlike the lavish final feast of lore, Coble's Last Supper was simple prison fare, nothing more. Texas law no longer affords that comfort to the condemned. Instead, Coble spent his final hours with a prison chaplain and saying goodbye to a few visitors. By early evening, as daylight faded, he was prepared for the fate decided so long ago. February 28, 2019, Huntsville, Texas. It's just past 6 p.m. inside the historic red brick walls unit, where Texas conducts its executions. On one side of the death chamber, 6 relatives of the Vicha family huddle together, awaiting closure. On the other side, Coble's family and friends gather, dreading goodbye. They are separated by a thick pane of glass, 2 small witness rooms, looking in on the same grim scene. In the chamber center, Billie Wayne Coble is strapped to a gurney, leather belts over his arms and chest. An IV line runs from his arm to a hidden room where executioners stand by. Coble cranes his neck to look through the window at the faces of those he loves and those he's harmed. A small microphone hangs above him, ready for his final statement. When the warden asks if he has any last words, Coble surprises everyone with a polite, almost casual remark. "Yes, sir, that will be $5, he says evenly. A puzzled silence falls over the witness rooms. $5? It's a bizarre statement at the brink of death. Later, some would speculate it referred to an old nickname, $5 bill, from his youth, but at that moment it hung in the air without explanation. Turning his head toward his own family behind the glass, Coble's hardened face softens. "I love you," he says to them, to each of them. "I love you." He then offers a final gentle instruction. "Take care." These simple words land with a quiet poignancy. Even Coble's victims' relatives watch in somber silence as the man who wiped out their family says goodbye to his own. At 6:14 p.m., the signal is given. The executioner begins pushing lethal pentobarbital into Coble's veins. Just then, as Coble finishes speaking, all hell breaks loose in the witness room. His son, Gordon Coble, unable to contain himself, suddenly pounds on the glass, separating him from his father. "No, no," he screams, his face red with anguish as tears spill over. A second man, Coble's 25-year-old grandson, Dalton, rises and joins the outburst. slamming his palms and trying to break through that barrier with sheer force. Bang, bang. The sound echoes in the chamber. Startled officers and witnesses whirl around as the furious commotion unfolds. Gordon's wife, Coble's daughter-in-law, collapses to her knees, sobbing and shouting in despair. In an eruption of grief, she hurls herself toward the door, crying out, "Why are you doing this? They just killed his daddy." Her wails carry into the chamber a raw, primal anguish. Security officers swarm in to subdue Coble's family. The small viewing room is now a storm of shouts, scuffling bodies, and grief-stricken chaos. Gordon and Dalton are dragged out, still struggling against the guards restraining them. The two men are wrestled to the ground handcuffed and removed from the building as the daughter-in-law continues to scream in the corridor. The other witnesses, including the stunned Vicha family members, look on in shock at the pandemonium unfolding before their eyes. Never in recent memory had an execution witness room erupted in such a manner. Meanwhile, on the other side of the glass, Billie Coble's fate is sealed. The lethal dose has been administered, and he can only listen faintly to the chaos as his consciousness fades. He emits a few labored gasps and then begins snoring softly, a sound that signals the sedative's effect taking hold. As Coble slips into unconsciousness, officials quickly draw the curtain to block the witness's view. At 6:24 p.m., a physician checks for a heartbeat. Finding none, he pronounces Billie Wayne Coble dead. It is done. After 30 years, the sentence has been carried out. Outside the death chamber, Gordon Coble and his son Dalton are placed in a squad car and taken directly to the Walker County Jail, charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest for their outburst. It's an extraordinary epilogue. A father executed, and by night's end his son and grandson sit in jail cells of their own. This is not a happy night, McLennan County District Attorney Barry Johnson tells reporters bluntly. This is the end of a horror story for the Vicha family. For the relatives of Robert, Zelda, and Bobby Vicha, the execution cannot erase the pain of the past 30 years, but it does bring a measure of finality. J.R. Vicha, the boy who survived Coble's wrath and grew up without his dad, expressed mixed feelings of relief. Knowing Coble is gone will be a relief, he said, after years of delays. Still, J.R. noted, the way they do it is more humane than what he did to my family. It's not what he deserves, but it's as much justice as allowed by the law. His words underscore the grim reality. Nothing could truly balance the scales of justice for a crime so cruel. In the end, the story of Billie Wayne Coble reached its dark conclusion in that Huntsville death chamber. What began as a domestic dispute swelled into an atrocity that wiped out 3 members of a family and scarred many others for life. The path to justice spanned decades, fraught with legal twists and emotional turmoil. Coble's final moments were accompanied not by peace or forgiveness, but by the raw agony and anger of those he was leaving behind. It was a viral true crime drama playing out in real time, a final furious coda to a tragic tale. And as the prison gates closed that night, the echoes of both Coble's eerie last words and his family's screams lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the human wreckage left in the wake of a killer's unforgivable acts.